right, so looks like we're starting now. So welcome to our session on financial decision making. It's a 2-hour session. We're going to have 6 papers that will be presented for 17 minutes. So that should leave us with about 15 minutes for audience questions at the end. So please remain muted if you're not presenting. So let's start with Bronson Argyle from BYU. He's going to be presenting personal bankruptcy, moral hazard, and shadow debt. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for chairing this session, and thank you to the conference organizers for including this paper on the program. This is joint work with Ben Iverson and Taylor Nadal, both of whom are also at BYU, and Chris Palmer, who is at MIT. So I don't think that I need to do a lot of work to motivate the importance of bankruptcy. It's clearly a very important topic and a very important component of the decision matrix for consumers as it pertains to credit. And what we are trying to add to this extensive literature is to answer this question right here, which I think is a very important question in this space, which is, does the option to delay bankruptcy increase socially inefficient indebtedness? And what I'm going to show you is that it does, that a exogenous increase of the time to file of 1 month is associated with an increase in debt, of unsecured debt, of about $4,000. And there's a commensurate increase in shadow debt. Shadow debt is debt that appears to not be showing up on a credit report. And I'll have more to say about that as the presentation progresses. Okay. So just to kind of paint this against the backdrop of the existing literature, most of the work that has been done in this space has focused on strategic filing, which is really an ex post moral hazard decision. Individuals have accumulated debt and they're making the decision whether or not to file for bankruptcy. This work, on the other hand, is really trying to get at much more of an ex ante moral hazard problem by looking at the strategic accumulation of debt leading up to filing for bankruptcy. I think the closest related work here is early work by Michelle White, and also this paper by Felipe Severino and Meta Brown. They show that using statewide variation in bankruptcy generosity, they show that increases in bankruptcy generosity lead to an increase in aggregate debt, but it has no effect on the likelihood that a person ultimately defaults. We're going to find similar results using data that's much more granular. And I think whereas their work leaves open the possibility that this is moral hazard, I think we're going to go hopefully a lot further in suggesting that that's the right way to think about what's going on here. Speaking of which, I'm going to say the term moral hazard, and there's this classic kind of moral hazard definition. If you think like Mas-Colell version of moral hazard, that individuals are going to run up debt knowing that they're going to declare bankruptcy and they won't have to pay it back. Now, alternatively, you may have in the back of your mind when you see our results, a gambling for resurrection story. Something like individuals are simply purchasing the necessities of life, just eking by, hoping to get back on their feet. Now, the reality is that if borrowers are unlikely to pay back this debt, then both of these are moral hazard. Really the distinction here is about the intentions of the filer. And I'm not going to have time today to show this, but in the paper, we have a model that shows that these two both lead to the same welfare implications. I am going to show you some extended results at the end of the paper that I think are suggestive. They're not airtight, but I think they're suggestive that what we're observing is actually a classical moral hazard story. Okay, so how do I want to spend the balance of my time? I want to talk about the data. I'm going to cup the model. If you want to see the model, you should have come to the AFA session where this paper was, or you have to read the paper. So I'm going to spend most of my time on the identification strategy and the empirical results. Okay, so where did our data come from? Our data are scraped from the PACER website for 4 different bankruptcy districts: Florida North, Florida South, Minnesota, and Utah. We're unable to get Florida Middle just because we didn't get a fee waiver for them. What we're scraping are the schedules that a person submits when they file for bankruptcy. And these are just incredibly detailed. We have line item information on their assets and liabilities. We have information about their demographics and family situation, their income, their projected future expenses. It's really kind of exciting, albeit very depressing data to work with. All of those schedules, we are able to process and turn into a usable form. all but about 15% of those. For various reasons, those schedules don't play nice with the algorithm that we're using to clean them up. All in all, this leads us to having a sample of a little bit more than 500,000 separate bankruptcy filers and over 15 million different individual debt claims. We're going to take this bankruptcy data and we're going to merge it with a sample of credit bureau data that we have. This merge is going to allow us to construct something called shadow debt. And I'm going to formally define that as the total unsecured debt on the bankruptcy filing less the total unsecured debt on the credit report. Now you may say to yourself, wait, isn't this the whole point of a credit registry? To have a complete picture of the household's debt? Well, not really. I mean, their job as a credit bureau is to report all the debt that is reported to them. And there are a number of creditors out in the marketplace that don't necessarily think of themselves as creditors. You think of something like a dentist's office that doesn't pull a credit report or report any credit instance to a credit bureau. But this is certainly debt that is being originated. So the key component here is the non-payment of goods and services. And this number, I think, is surprisingly large. For the average filer in our sample, they have about $40,000 in shadow debt. And of that $40,000, 30,000 of it is actually in formal categories like credit cards, student loans, personal loans. We're going to be most interested in that leftover piece, that informal shadow debt that doesn't fit into one of these bins. But I think that these summary statistics are really interesting. How do we get to that categorization? We're going to use the descriptions of the loans and we're going to put those through an augmented LDA that's going to allow us to sort all of the different loan obligations that a filer has into a number of different categories. We're then going to take those categories and we're going to map them to the bins that correspond to a credit report, namely credit card and retail debt, student loans, and personal loans. Everything that's left over, we're going to call that's uncategorized, we're going to call that informal shadow debt. And I'm going to show you that all the action when we look at shadow debt is actually in that informal shadow debt component. Okay. So in terms of summary statistics, the average income for a filer in our sample is about $3,000. They have about $130,000 in assets and about $100,000 more than that in total debt. Okay. As I said, I'm going to skip over the model that really just connects this kind of classic moral hazard and gambling for resurrection story in terms of its welfare implications and jump right into the identification strategy. How are we going to get identification here? Well, we're going to exploit exogenous changes to wage garnishment and how wage garnishment affects people's incentives to file for bankruptcy. The idea here is that if more of my wages are being garnished, then I have an incentive to file sooner. And we want to know, well, what happens in terms of debt accumulation if those are the incentives that you have. How do we get exogenous variation in wage garnishment? For a band of the income distribution, the wage garnishment equation is a function of the federal minimum wage. So we're going to exploit changes to the federal minimum wage that affect wage garnishment to change incentives for people to file sooner or later for bankruptcy. Now, we do a lot of work, and I'll mention this a little bit later in the presentation, to examine the possibility that changes to the minimum wage actually change the composition of filers. This would be a threat to our identification. All the tests that we do in the paper that, like I said, I'll mention a little bit later, none of them are consistent with a story that the composition of filers is changing. And also the magnitudes that we observe are going to be too large to ascribe to either a direct income effect. You know, if you think that the results that we are observing are coming from people that are actually earning minimum wage and are making more now, or the mechanical reduction in wage garnishment. The fact that less of my wages are being garnished, which means less of my wages are being used to pay down debt. So I'm going to mechanically have more debt when I file. But the magnitudes that we observe are just far too large to ascribe to either of these two kind of mechanical channels. Okay, this is the monthly garnishable wages as a function of monthly income. And you can see exactly what I was describing, that there's this income band for which changes to the minimum wage actually change your garnishable wages. So we're going to define the treated sample as that sample that gets affected by minimum wage changes, and the control sample is going to be everybody else. So the first stage regression is the effect of minimum wage changes on the delay to file bankruptcy. And the second stage is going to be the effect of that instrumented bankruptcy delay onto debt accumulation behavior. Okay, so how do we measure the delay to bankruptcy? Well, ideally, what we would have is when someone mentally declared bankruptcy. Now we're going to use as a proxy for that the time between when they first went 90 days delinquent and when they ultimately filed for bankruptcy. And our results are robust to various kind of different measures here. You can use when they went 120 days delinquent or their most recent 90-day delinquency. The point is that we want a proxy for how long someone is in distress. Using this measure, the average time to file is a little bit less than 2 years, and the median time is a little bit more than a year. Okay, so our first stage specification then is going to be this months to file, the delay to file for bankruptcy. Onto the variable of interest is going to be this interaction between a treatment dummy and garnishable wages. Now, of course, we want to control for income. So we're going to control for income in the treated sample here with this interaction. And outside of the treated sample, income and garnishable wages are collinear. So we're controlling for income here in the control sample by including garnishable wages. We're going to include a number of filer controls. And then we're going to include fixed effects for the bankruptcy district and the year. And then we'll also have some specifications where we include different measures of income. You know, if we think that there's some nonlinear relationship between debt accumulation behavior and income, we're going to try to rule that out with these other fixed effects. And then we're going to double cluster the standard errors by month and 3-digit zip code. Okay, so here's the first stage results. We can see that for a $100 increase in garnishable wages is measured in $100 increments. We see that that reduces the time to file by about a month. Now, if we just pause for a little bit and talk about the exclusion restriction here, the exclusion restriction is that conditional on income and the other filer controls we have, changes to the minimum wage don't affect debt accumulation directly, but only do so through the time that the individuals delay. So one possible threat here, as I mentioned before, is that the composition of filers changed. And in the paper, we look at things like the likelihood that someone files for bankruptcy, the debt levels of non-filers, the income distribution, and none of these things change with the change in minimum wage. So it makes this story that our results are due to a change in composition all the more difficult to tell. It's also true that this result, that the composition doesn't seem to change, it also rhymes with stuff in the existing literature, findings in the existing literature. I mentioned this paper by Severino and Brown that found that there was no change in aggregate default probability, which is the same kind of result that we have here. Tacking on to that is this magnitude problem with an alternative explanation, that the second stage results are just far too large to ascribe to a composition change. Okay. So if we look at the reduced form second stage, we see that the unsecured debt share, so this is unsecured debt as a fraction of total debt, of total assets. We see that for a $100 increase in garnishable wages, we have about a 50% reduction in unsecured debt share, which corresponds to about $1,200. I think the two-stage least squares estimates are easier to interpret here, where we see that for a 1-month increase in the delay to file, we get about a 1% increase in the unsecured debt share, which is about $4,000. You can also do this analysis instead of using the debt share, using like the log unsecured debt, just focusing on the numerator, you get very similar magnitudes. Okay, so let's push on this a little bit. We can ask the question, well, what kind of debt do delaying filers incur? Do they incur shadow debt? And that's exactly what we find. A 1-month increase in the delay to file leads to a 1.7% increase in shadow debt, which is about $6,300. We're unable to reject the hypothesis that this coefficient is no bigger than the coefficient on unsecured debt share, meaning that the increase in unsecured debt is potentially all in shadow debt. We can push on this even further and we can say, well, let's look at, it's certainly true that if we look at this graphically really quick, that the effect is only for the treated sample. If we look for the control sample, it looks very, very flat. Sorry, so let me go back or let me keep going on this then. We can also ask the question of, well, what kinds of shadow debt do individuals accumulate? Is it in formal categories? That would be somewhat odd. You know, these are categories where individuals there's a formal process for accumulating debt, and most likely individuals that are just on the brink of filing for bankruptcy have already maxed out all the formal channels. And in fact, what we find is that all of the increase in shadow debt is in the informal shadow debt, this uncategorized, difficult to define what it is, component or category. Okay, so In the last 2 or 3 minutes that I have, I want to return to this slide from early on about whether this is kind of the classic moral hazard story or if this is a gambling for resurrection story. It's certainly true that people accumulate more debt if we give them more time, but can we try to get at the intention and the underlying motivation? This is really, really difficult to get at, but we do an exercise in the paper to try to speak to this in the way that we can, which is the following. Let's identify individuals that we think are filing for bankruptcy for strategic reasons, reasons that are not because they had a major life event. So we're going to define these individuals, and we'll use the term strategic debtors if you'll permit it. They are going to be debtors that have less than $500 in medical debt, so they didn't have a major medical problem. They're employed, so they haven't lost their job, and they're not separated or divorced. Now, this isn't perfect, and this measure is certainly noisy. But what we're trying to do is separate out those individuals that we think are filing for reasons that are potentially strategic. That would be, they're thinking about accumulating debt for reasons other than just necessities of life. If we look at the first stage, we see no significant difference. So everybody delays for about a month when the change to wage garnishment occurs, but they do very different things with this month. And what we observe is that all of the debt accumulation behavior that I showed you before is highlighted in this strategic sample. This is the unsecured debt share. This is the shadow debt share. This is the informal shadow debt share. So these results, they do two things. One is they make it very difficult to tell a story that this is due to a direct income or garnishable wage effect, mechanical effect, because that would affect both of these samples. Two, they're suggestive that this is a classic moral hazard story and not simply just gambling for resurrection by individuals that had a major life event and then had to end up filing for bankruptcy. Okay, and I think that I'm just about out of time. So let me conclude there by saying that the work that we've done shows that bankruptcy filers that can file more slowly and are allowed to delay, they accumulate more debt. That this looks to be like a classic moral hazard. In my heart of hearts, I don't think there's a distinction between the classic moral hazard or the gambling for resurrection story. But if there is a distinction, it seems like some of the results that we observe are suggestive that it's a classic moral hazard story. Second, shadow debt is a really important piece of the balance sheet of bankruptcy filers. This is the kind of debt that individuals accumulate heading into bankruptcy. And more than that, not only shadow debt, but informal shadow debt that's difficult to categorize and difficult to observe on a credit report. All these things lead us to the conclusion that any policy that can help us to identify individuals that are in distress sooner and help shepherd them into bankruptcy sooner can potentially be welfare improving. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that great presentation, Bronson. Next up, we have Yaron, leading from USC, presenting Mind the App, Mobile Access to Financial Information and Consumer Behavior. Okay, you're muted, Yaron. Okay, there we go.
1, 2, 3. Hello, sorry about that. I just wanted to say that we are excited to present this paper in this great session. This is a joint work with Shlomo Bernarzi from UCLA. And let me go directly into what we're doing. Before that, we studied the impact of mobile devices on consumer behavior. I would like to start out by pointing that the way we consume our financial information, our personal financial information, things like our account balance, our recent transactions, have changed dramatically over the last 2 decades. In the 90s, we had to wait for a mail, in the snail mail, or call the bank. In the 2000s, we could use a personal computer, and it's only been about 10 years that we can use our mobile devices to know how much money we have in our bank account. Of course, the adoption of mobile phones is a global phenomenon. It's still increasing, and the usage of these financial apps on mobile devices is very high and still increasing. In the US, it's approximately 90%. So given the scale of this phenomenon of using mobile devices to get information about your personal finances, we ask in this paper, how does this access on a mobile device influences the consumer behavior? And what we will do is we will look at several consumers that already had access to an app through their personal computer and decided to install a mobile app of the same platform and see how they change their behavior. Now, why would installing the mobile app when you already have a PC app should change the behavior of consumers? There are many theories, and we will not be able to pinpoint the exact one. What we will try to do is to find the one that are most consistent, that provide a prediction that are most similar to our findings. So we start with a class of theories that are talking about the relating to the availability of information. The first one is limited attention. Consumers trade off the cost and the benefit of getting the information and keeping it fresh in mind. With a reduction in the cost of accessing the information that is created by the mobile devices, we would expect people to be more attentive to their finances because it's less costly. And even if information is a good thing, then they will make better decision, more informed decision. That is consistent with some evidence showing that people actually do check their account balances while in the store with something that they couldn't do in the past using a PC, and oftentimes about 50% of the time decide to not purchase an item that they wanted. The second class of theories are theories about self-control. People have a good plan to maybe change their spending habits. With the introduction of the mobile device, it might serve as a soft commitment, a reminder that makes us feel bad when we go into the store and start spending money if we just checked our account balance. Think about you walk into an ice cream store and there is a scale at the entrance. Okay, so you see, maybe even if you do not scale yourself, just having it there, it's a reminder that maybe you should not be eating ice cream. And the last one, very closely related, is information-dependent utility. The information has an impact, direct impact on the utility of the consumer beyond the information content. And that predicts that people with lower income that are more sensitive to viewing their account balances will react more. They will try to avoid getting this information because it makes them feel bad. We call that the ostrich effect, and presumably will respond more aggressively to these changes. One class of theories that I just want to mention, but we will have nothing to say in this paper, but we think that it's important. These mobile apps allow for better monitoring of other household members. If in the self-control model we had a conflicted self, we might have conflict between household members. One would like to save more, the other one spends. These mobile apps might have a strong impact there, and maybe leading to better spending decisions, or maybe even leading to higher divorce rates. We cannot say anything in this paper. And another class of studies that I'm just going to mention, mobile devices have been documented to cause a lower quality decision-making, either because of the presence of the mobile device, it's a distracting object, or the different hardware features of it, the touchscreen, the screen size, or the layout of the apps, which is different. All have been associated with poor decision making. We have nothing to say in this paper because people are not switching from the PC to the mobile device. They are using it in addition to. So we cannot have a direct evidence to contribute here much. And of course, there is a large literature on the impact of technology on consumer behavior, especially in the fintech space. So what we do is we get data from a personal financial management app. They have millions of users. They provide account aggregation technology. Now it's commonly used in academia as well. It was pioneered by our session chair in their science paper. So if you are still not familiar with it, it allows the user to link all their accounts into one spot and view all their transactions instead of going to one app by one to different banks or credit cards or mortgages accounts separately. The important features of the app for us are, first of all, you cannot do anything on this app except for viewing your information. If you want to make a transaction or a transfer between accounts, you have to go to your bank account. You cannot do that in this app. And the mobile app and the PC apps are identical. There are no differences between them. At the time of this data, between the mobile and the PC app, and we observe the full transaction of the consumers and their login activity, which we use as a proxy for the level of attention. Of course, there is a problem that people choose if they want to adopt the app or not. We have this endogeneity problem. And what we do, we'll divide it into two. First of all, people get to choose if they want to install the app or not. And we have nothing to say about that. Our results are conditional on the adoption of the mobile app, as is common in this literature. But I just want to say that this is very common. Most people today are only installing the mobile app. The sample is not very different on that dimension than the rest of the population. The timing is also endogenously chosen, and for that, we use the release of the 3 mobile apps as our instrument. So what we can see here are the number of installs of these mobile apps for these 3 devices, iPhone, iPad, and Android. And what we can see is that immediately after the release of each of these apps, there was a large mass, a number of users that installed it on that day, or on the several days after the release. And we say that it will not be very likely that many users endogenously decided to install the app on a given week. It's not likely that that week will be exactly the release date of the app, and it's not likely to happen 3 times because the release of the apps happened at 3 separate dates. So we conclude that this one, the release of the app, which is exogenous to the user, constitute a valid instrument because users would have installed it in a different time if the app was released sooner or later. We include people in the sample that have been using the PC app for at least 3 months before installing the mobile app. They are reasonably active with respect to the number of logins before the launch or before installing the mobile app. We can see sufficient number of accounts, and they have a reasonable level of income and spending. We define 2 samples. The sample that we care about, we call it sample X for exogenous. These are the people that installed the mobile app in the 14 days after it was released. And sample N for endogenous are the rest of them. We want to use them because we have much more power there as a robustness check, but these people decided to, we do not have a valid instruments for them. Our main variable of interest is discretionary spending. These are things that people can relatively easily adjust in the short term, things like gifts, hobbies, entertainment. You can see here the full list. Importantly, the transactions are automatically classified into spending categories, and we choose the spending categories that constitute the consumer discretionary sector according to the global industry classification. So we try to stay as objective as we can, and our results are robust to different definitions of discretionary spending. Here are the summary statistics for the both of the samples. We can see that the number of average monthly logins is approximately 10 and 14 for these 2 samples. Approximately 5 are coming from a personal computer. iPhone users are the most heavy users, followed by the Android, and the third one are the iPad users. This sample is relatively wealthy. The average monthly income is above 10K. Spending is approximately in the ballpark, 9 to 10K. Discretionary spending is about a third or fourth of this overall spending, with leading categories of restaurants, clothing, entertainment, travel. And we also look at cash withdrawals that are not part of discretionary spending, but they also spending category that we do not directly observe what the money was used for. Okay, it's an intention to spend at a later date. This is our very simple specification. We just have a short one just to see what changes before and after. We have a panel data from T-3 to T+12, and we also do the same simple regression with event month indicators. So let's start with the first one, which is the logins, our proxy for attention. What we can see here that for both samples, sample X and sample N, the attention, the average monthly login shoots up immediately after the installation of the mobile app from approximately 4 times per month to more than 16 times per month, okay, or about 12 times for sample N. This is an immediate effect, and it's persistent. It lasts for the next 12 months that we can observe. And more interesting, or as interesting, is that the logins are on the mobile device are in addition to the PC logins and not a substitute. So people are still using their PC just as before. We look at the timing of the logins, and what we can see here, these are the logins before from desktop only. Here we see the desktop, and the red line are the mobile logins. We can see that there is a new demand for information around 5 to 6 p.m., which is a retail peak time, that people use their phones and did not log in at that time before. That is consistent with people actually using it at the store to view their accounts. You can say that, okay, people have more time after work, but you can see that there was no such an increase before the release of the mobile devices. This is the main result. The discretionary spending also drops down significantly, approximately 8% or 11% for the two different samples. The effect is immediate and persistent. Okay, so people are cutting their spending immediately after installing the mobile app. And the effect is stronger for people with relatively lower income. In our sample, we split it into two based on income and spending to income ratio, and the effects are stronger for the low income and high spending to income, people that are likely more sensitive to viewing their account balances. Okay, just for robustness, we see that there is no change in things that we would not expect to change, like utilities, telephone, and rent. This is our falsification test. We do a lot of them. I will skip that. We do a lot of work to make sure that there is no pre-trend or no just naturally occurring decline in discretionary spending. And let me skip already to the implication of this study to the theory. So first of all, we see that there is a dramatic change both in the attention that people are paying to their finances and their spending habits after installing a mobile device. With respect to rational inattention, we can see that there is a demand for information that was not met before. We have seen that in the intraday plot and the increase in login activity at that time. So there does seem to be an improvement in the access to information. However, we think that the decline in the cost of information is not that big to justify an 11% drop in discretionary spending. After all, you can view your personal information on the PC device in the morning, and it doesn't change very much, right, from the morning or over a course of several days. So we think that the more likely explanation would be a self-control coupled and information-dependent utility. People are more influenced by the salience of the information. The fact that it's on the phone serves as a reminder to their long-term intention, to their non-myopic self. And the differential effect between the high and low income is also consistent with the information-dependent utility models. So we have many things that we need to figure out, but we think that it's important to document these effects. We clearly want to check it on different populations, or to see how other features of the app, like transactions, etc., influence the behavior of individuals. And just to conclude, we see that approximately every 10 years, we have a big shift in the platform that we are using. If we started with phones, then we moved to PC, and now we are at mobile devices. We see every time that there is a series of studies showing the impact on investor behavior, consumer behavior, etc. So we need to keep in mind that in mind for the next change. And it's important to remember, because today the default, the average person that installs these apps only uses the mobile app. Fewer people have PCs and use them for doing their finances. And I believe that I'm out of time. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Ron. So next we have Rich Patterson from West Point. He's going to present how much to save, decision costs, and retirement plan participation. Take it away.
And so, Michael, I
Yeah.
got kicked off my computer, so I can't
Oh.
share my screen again. So I logged back on.
Oh, okay. Lisa, are you there? Is it possible to add Rich again? Let me message her.
Yes, I heard you.
Oh,
I'll
okay.
add you right. I'll add you right now.
Okay, thanks.
You should be all set.
Okay. Let's see. I still don't have it. Oh, there it looks like I got it now. All right, so thank you so much, and exciting to follow such excellent papers. And this is work on decision costs and retirement plan participation. This is joint work with Jacob Golden at Stanford, Tatiana Homanoff at NYU, Bill Skimmyhorn at William & Mary. And because we use lots of administrative data from federal government sources, we've got a standard disclaimer here that these opinions are ours and not those of any of the federal agencies that we work with. So the motivation for this paper is that deciding how much to save for retirement is a complicated decision. And the complexity of this decision may significantly contribute to people contributing at lower savings rates than they would if this decision process were simplified. And so there's a large literature that shows that defaults and automatic enrollment increase retirement plan participation. And I saw Bridget Madrian in the group at one point, and her seminal work along with others has shown how big these default effects, how much they matter, and they matter a lot. And because that has been such an important finding in this literature, I think it's interesting to explore some of the things that are going on with those defaults. In particular, an automatic enrollment bundles both an extensive margin default, whether someone participates or not, with several intensive margin defaults, such as the contribution rate at which someone will contribute and the type of fund that they will be contributing to. And so our question here is whether reducing the complexity on the intensive margin, and in our case, how much to contribute to a retirement savings account, is going to impact extensive margin behavior, or whether someone will contribute to their retirement savings account. And the theory that that's motivating this research is that decision costs about how much to save may actually depress retirement plan participation on that extensive margin. And so we're going to explore whether reducing intensive margin decision costs can affect a retirement plan participation with a large-scale RCT that we conduct within the Department of Defense among active duty Army service members. And in particular, we're going to experimentally vary the complexity by highlighting a potential participation plan contribution rate. And so a little bit of background here is that the retirement plan that we're going to investigate here is the Thrift Savings Plan, which is the federal government's defined contribution retirement plan for all federal employees. And at least at the time of our study, all federal employees were eligible to contribute, but the plan administration varied by whether you were a military service member or a civilian. And so military service members was an opt-in program. They had to actively enroll in order to participate in the program. However, civilians were defaulted into participation, and service members did not receive a contribution match, whereas civilians could receive matching up to 5% of their contributions. So as a result, we see much lower participation rates among service members, so around 43% compared to the 90% of civilians. And another important aspect of this plan, at least at the time of this, this study is the decision was to contribute a specific rate. So service members needed to, it wasn't an amount of their check, it was a specific percentage, which was a whole number percentage of their base earnings that they could contribute to their retirement plan. And so our experiment, what we took is around approximately 300,000 active duty service members who weren't already participating in the TSP were randomly assigned into one of 10 treatment groups. So we've got our control group that just business as usual, nothing happens. And then there's a baseline treatment group. So they receive a one-time email communicating the benefits of the Thrift Savings Program, and how they could enroll. And in fact, this email was actually based on a prior RCT run through the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. And we used the message that was most effective at getting people to participate from that previous study. But then we added for our other treatment groups a specific rate prompt. And so they are highlighted, this treatment had that same baseline message, but also highlighted a potential rate of contribution. And those were at 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 8%. So we had 8 specific rate groups in addition to these control and baseline groups. And to show you what these treatments look like, this is the message received by those in the baseline email group. It says, now's a good time to save. If you put in a little bit a long time ago, you'd have a whole lot today. And now here are 3 simple steps that you can take in order to start saving. Our specific rate groups have the same identical email, except for this all caps sentence in the middle, which says, many service members like you start by contributing at least X% of their basic pay, which would be into their traditional or Roth TSP account. So that specific rate would be anything between 1 and 8%. And that really is the only difference between these two messages, is this all caps line highlighting this specific rate. And so we use data, administrative data from DFAS, and that includes the monthly TSP contribution rate selection, along with the administrator of the TSP program, the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, administrative data, which includes quarterly account level data on balances and fund selection. We combine these two sources of retirement savings data with administrative personnel data from the Department of Army, which allows us to look at demographic information and whether someone retains in the Army after treatment. And so to give you an idea of what this population looks like, they're fairly young, average age around 28. They're ethnically and racially diverse, but they are mostly men, about half are married. And they are not highly educated in terms of degree receipt. Only fewer than 20% have a bachelor's degree. But as far as their ability level, this AFQT score, that's a nationally normed test to be representative of high school math and reading ability. And what we see is a 50 would be right at the 50th percentile of ability. So these are individuals that are right around average ability for young adult Americans, so slightly above average. And so they've been in the Army an average of 6 years, and they're mostly enlisted service members. So that's what our population looks like for this study. And because this is an RCT, our empirical approach is quite simple. We're just going to regress the treatment designation, whether you're in the baseline treatment or a specific rate group, on a savings outcome. And we're going to include a vector of control variables, which include age, sex, race, marital status, education, AFQT scores, et cetera. As I'm going to show you in one slide, these demographic characteristics aren't going to matter at all for our estimations, which is reassuring given our RCT design. And so this RCT, these are based on the last 2 digits of individual social security numbers. That's how the randomization in this study occurs. And so for just our kind of main baseline results, we find that now these are, if I have to tell you what these are, these look really big. These are percentage points. So this is 0.4 of a percentage point. So this is not a 40% increase. It's a 0.4 percentage point increase in ever contributing to the thrift savings plan in the baseline treatment. And then we see that for the specific rate group, it's almost double. So the specific rate treatments are almost twice as effective as those in the baseline treatment. And you can see that the specific rate versus baseline p-values, that these are statistically distinguishable from each other in terms of whether someone participates. So we get significantly higher participation when someone's exposed to the specific rate messaging as opposed to just the standard baseline email messaging. And these effects, they're persistent over time. So over the 2-year window that we are able to observe people's participation, these treatment effects persist for these specific rate treatments, and that's true against the baseline group as well. And so this is just suggesting that our intervention is actually creating new participants to the TSP rather than just speeding up enrollments among people who would have always participated to the TSP, just would have slightly later. So just a few more notes about these effects. One concern might be that that members who join are doing so against their best interests and might be more likely to unenroll later. We actually don't see any evidence of this. If anything, people who are induced to participate are less likely to unenroll in the program than those in the control group. Are these effects driven by these larger effects among the rate prompt groups driven by certain prompt groups? What we find is that the effects are somewhat larger for the lower rate groups, these 1 and 2 percentage point rate prompts, but these differences are still robust to excluding these specific rate groups. And finally, does our treatment have any effect on retention in the Army? We wouldn't suspect that it would, but we don't find any evidence on retention. So these long run effects that we observed in the slide before, they're not driven by retention in the Army. They are driven by participation in the TSP program. So why are we seeing increased participation among those in the specific rate treatment groups? Our explanation, our preferred explanation, is that this reduction in decision costs increases participation. So you can take someone, they want to save, but they don't know what the optimal or even a reasonable amount would be. And because this ambiguity is unpleasant, or they just think that they'll find out later, they delay this decision or just put off this decision entirely and choose not to participate. And for the type of person that doesn't want to participate until they know what a reasonable rate would be to contribute, providing such a person a specific rate can simplify this decision process and increase participation on the extensive margin. So that's the explanation that we have in mind. And we're going to provide 2 pieces of evidence that are consistent with this type of explanation. And so the first piece of evidence is that providing someone a specific rate increases the likelihood of contributing exactly that specific rate. And it doesn't increase the probability of contributing at other rates. And so to understand what this graph is saying, take the 2 percentage point effects for example, and this is the fraction of people in the baseline treatment group that are contributing exactly 2%. This light blue bar is the fraction of people who got a rate prompt of 2% and are contributing exactly 2%. And this group is all of the other specific rate groups. So 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, they're pooled together. And this is the average contribution rate among people, or the fraction of people contributing exactly 2% who received a prompt other than 2%. So these 2 groups, these baseline group and these other rate groups, look exactly the same, but the people that got prompted to contribute 2% are contributing at 2% at a much higher rate. And this pattern is consistent across all 8 percentage point treatments. So you see those who are prompted to contribute 1% are more likely to contribute at exactly 1%. same at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we see this consistent pattern of specific rate prompts increasing plan participation at exactly that contribution rate that was prompted. The second piece of evidence is that in addition to selecting a contribution rate, enrollees have the opportunity to select a fund allocation. But unlike contribution rate selection, which is mandatory, someone can't contribute without choosing a contribution rate, individuals can choose to participate without selecting a fund type. So individuals who participate in the TSP have a choice between 6 different funds, and the default is a government bonds fund called the G fund. And what we find is that those among contributors, those in the specific rate group are significantly more likely to be contributing to this default fund, which is consistent with individuals who are facing decision complexity. They are going with the path of least resistance. And our specific rate group is getting people to contribute who are not being sophisticated over the type of fund that they're contributing to, or at least they're not changing from the default option. So, to broadly summarize the results of this presentation, we find that that communications that reduce the complexity of this savings decision were almost twice as effective at increasing participations as similar communications that didn't highlight any type of specific contribution rate. And we also find that these individuals were more likely to make these passive decisions about the other intensive margin aspect of the choice. And this is consistent with a path of least resistance, that as we decrease intensive decision costs, we're likely to see increased extensive participation in financial behavior. So these results, we think, shed light on mechanisms by which behavioral interventions like defaults and automatic enrollment shape savings behavior. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for that, Rich. Next, we have Jaime Ruiz-Tagle from University of Chile. I was going to present Whisper Words of Wisdom, How Financial Counseling Can Reduce Delinquency in Consumer Loans. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, give me a second. I'm finding the, okay, here I go. And this is full screen now, right?
Yes, we can see you.
Good, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for attending this session. I'm very pleased to represent my co-authors, Roberto Alvarez and Alvaro Miranda from Chile as well. We have been working with several institutions in this project. The Banco Estado, which is the main state bank in Chile, and the Inter-American Development Bank and the Bank Association, who have funded this research as well, right? So let me, sorry, yeah. I'm gonna tell you about the paper in one page. First of all, what we want to do is that we want to study whether there is some space for financial counseling to have an effect in low-income clients from a public bank in Chile. We're going to make an intervention using a randomized experiment with administrative data. And we're going to send the messages on a weekly basis. We're going to send 3 types of messages. One message is a neutral message, just pointing to the website so that the individuals can remind that they have a credit in the bank. Then we have a set of messages about how to prevent and face shocks when they have a shock. And they are focused on to tackle present bias and social comparison, so that we are incorporating some behavioral aspects of the psychological side of the literature. And the third set of messages is it includes, on top of the sets of messages I mentioned above, practical options to deal with the bank in case they want to, for example, reschedule the payments they have to do or the like. And we have 3 main results. The first of all is that the content of the messages matter. So what we find is that those messages with include a practical counseling are significantly more effective than those who only relate to psychological aspects. And then we find that the effects are much larger on those who ex ante are more likely to fall into arrears. Those are mainly males and young people and low income, between this low income group that we are intervening. And finally, we have that the intervention is highly cost effective, and this will allow large savings by the bank, which is very important in terms of the cost effectiveness and how you can extend this to other environments. Okay, so what we have here is that the problem of financial inclusion is very important, because low-income borrowers, they have a very large delinquency rates. For example, in this sample we are intervening, there are 35% in Banco Estado compared to the average of the system, which is 4 to 6%. And the main point of view to tackle this problem has been providing financial education. And the people think that just by providing education, the people will behave better in the financial system, so that they will access lower interest rate. But the problem is that it is expensive, and financial education also has the problem of low take-up, and has proven to be low effective in terms of how can actually that translate from attitudes, from knowledge to attitudes to decisions in the financial market. And so what we had in mind is that we can think about low-cost intervention based on psychological insights included in text messages. And we have observed that these could be useful for reducing delinquency rates. In the literature, we can find that, for example, simple reminders that can fight limited attention. And also, more related to our paper is that the content, in this case, for example, of the paper by Burskin et al., appealing to moral behavior, could be more useful to decrease loan delinquency rates. In our case, the content will differ depending on the psychological insight we want to appeal, or if we want to include practical information. Okay. Good. So what we want to do here is that we have seen in practice that financial counseling is something that occurs in normal in jobs. There are job counselors within firms, and in other contexts we find social workers or even clinical psychologists that are giving financial counseling to individuals. And so what we think is that we can break this idea of the financial education only works on young individuals, and we can move on from mainly changing attitudes, and we want to concentrate our attention on outcomes. So what we're going to do here is we're going to attempt to mimic, in a very simplified version, an in-person financial counseling, and we're doing that just by sending weekly text messages. So the intervention is very simple. We have 3 treatment arms. We have T0, which is treatment 0, neutral informative messages pointing to the bank website. Then we have treatment 1, appealing to cognitive financial counseling, giving information about how to prevent and face financial shocks. And for these, we are using both text, comics, and videos that we are sending to the individuals. And then on top of that, we have treatment 2, which is a practical financial counseling with information adding concrete options offered by the bank to face shocks and delays. Okay, so so what we have is that, for example, in the case of the cognitive financial counseling, we are mostly concentrated on self-control problems. For example, trying to prevent impulsive purchases, social comparison, and so that, for example, we have messages like this, and we have, look, there is a sale. How do you look at that? You're interested in, and then you think it twice and you don't buy it, right? So we send these comics to the individuals, and we have this practical financial counseling where we're sending these messages, for example, that say, look, you can reschedule, you can come to the to the bank and reschedule and think about the deadlines of the installment amounts, and then you can deal with the bank with your loan much more easily. And then these messages were sent on random weekdays at the evening, because we made some focus groups to ask the people when do you want to receive these type of messages. We're in a random order. And we tried the people not to receive too many messages, because we know that receiving too much information could be not working very well. Okay, so we invited the people from all the people who took a loan on a given month. We discarded those above 65 years old, because there are different types of individuals in general. We invited them to participate. And we selected those who were more likely to fall into arrears. And we created a model to predict who were more likely to raise, like a credit scoring, basically. And then we selected those who were more likely to fall into arrears, because we thought that the intervention could be more effective on those type of individuals. And then we invited them to participate, and the people who participated, we randomizedly assigned them to the different treatments. And so the scheme looks like this. We have the monthly loans placement. We have some sort of selection. Here is all selection. We took the people who are under 65. Then we have this predictive model. We selected those who were more likely to fall into arrears, and then we invited them with the call center, and those who accepted, we assigned them randomly to these groups. And of course, in the acceptance rate wasn't 100%, it was about 50%. And we know that there is some sort of selection. And in fact, I won't tell you much here, but we found that people who were more likely to accept to participate in general were those who with a lower delinquency rate ex post. So this is a very simple RCT. So the empirical strategy is fairly simple. And we have stratification. We had stratification by age, by gender, and by ex-ante probability of falling into arrears. And then we have basically three main outcomes, which are the delinquency rate at 30 days, at 60 days, and at 90 days. Of course, the longer the period, the less likely, the lower would be the delinquency rate, first of all, and the lower the likelihood that these loans will be paid back by the individual, right? Okay, so this is an overview of the results. We were following the individuals on a weekly basis. And for example, at week 12, we had that we had a sample of about 4,000 individuals, a bit above that. And then we have that the larger effect will be at the 30 days delinquency rate. We have a reduction, especially by T2, of 20. And in 61 days delay, we have a reduction of about 32%. So look at the base, the base delinquency rate were fairly low. And of course, that will increase the longer the period we will look at the individuals. For example, if we look at the individuals at week 24, we'll find that the effects are larger, but they are larger, especially for those who are with a delinquency rate at 60 days or at 90 days. And we have reduction of between 20 and 32, the largest delinquency rates. Okay, so this is how they look like. For example, this is 30 days delinquency rate. We are following, we have the intervention at week 0, and we are following on a weekly basis. And here we're looking at both treatments altogether compared to the neutral one. And then we have them separated. We can see that very early on at week 9, the effect seems much larger if we think about the practical financial counseling. So what we find is a reduction in the delinquency rates of about 20%, okay? And then if we look at 60-day delinquency rate, we see that in the short run, there is not much, in the average, there is not much effect. And then very clearly from the very beginning, the effect is driven by the practical financial counseling on top of the cognitive counseling, right? And the reduction is about 20% on average here. If we look at 90 days delay, we see that the effect, of course, starts later, because for 90 days delay, you have to pass already 3 months. And that happens to be about the week 17 that you start seeing that the reduction in delinquency rates is about 26%, right? Okay, so then we look at who are more likely to fall in, to be affected by this intervention. And we see that those, for example, who are the youngest, those below 35 years old, have a reduction in delinquency days, in delinquency rate of, for example, reducing from 10% to 6.5% at 60 days delay, and from 7.8% to 3.8% at 90 days delay. So most of the effect comes from the practical financial counseling for the young individuals, and especially at 60 and 90 days delay. If we look at those who had a larger probability of falling into arrear ex ante, we find a similar effect. The effects are a bit smaller, and but still the reduction are very large. So we have, for example, a reduction from 11% delinquency rate to 7% delinquency rates. And then from 8.8 delinquency rate to 5.5. These are very large effects, okay? And then we make this distinction. We see, for example, what happened with by gender to men, and ex ante, men are more likely to fall into arrears, and we see that those are always also more affected by the by T2, which is the financial counseling that includes this practical advice. Okay, so in addition, we look at those who have a lower income. Those who lower income also were more likely to fall into arrears, and again we find that all the effects come from T2. Okay, so the last thing we're gonna look is whether there is an effect of the neutral message, right? We couldn't have a pure control group in the sense that they will not receive any message at all. So the only way to assess whether the neutral message had a real effect was to make a synthetic control group. And we made that out of the people who didn't accept to participate, and those who were not found by the call center to be included. And comparing to that group, we made this synthetic control group by using matching tools, and we found that there is a reduction in delinquency rates of about 10 to 23% on average, depending on what app the definition you're using, if you're using all the messages all together or any treatment at all. And so the next question is whether this intervention is really cost effective or not. Here we're intervening a bit more than 4,000 individuals, so it's a very small sample that we could accumulate within a few months of the newcomers to the bank. And what we found is that there is a reduction in delinquency rate. That means that this money is arriving to the bank because the people are actually paying back the money. And this implies savings of about $69,000 to $110,000, depending if you're looking at 30 days delay or at 90 days delay. Of course, the delinquency rates at 90 days delay are a bit smaller, so that the effect that you can have with the financial counseling is smaller, right? And so the main conclusion of our paper is that you can find a way to reduce the delinquency rates of these consumer loans held by low-income individuals by sending simple text messages that are giving cognitive and practical counseling. So this is very important because in the literature, they have found very few ways to reduce the delinquency rates of individuals in this type of group, and that will affect financial inclusion later on. We also find that there is an effect of the neutral message. So just by sending some reminder will affect the individual's behavior, and we find that this is a reduction of about 19%, which is very important. More importantly, this is very cost effective. policy, so you can implement this in different environments and see whether there is an effective an effect in the reduction of the delinquency rates. Here is very cost effectively, and this can facilitate significantly the inclusion of financial individuals. And finally, we find that these effects are much more important for those who were ex ante more likely to fall into arrears, mainly low-income individuals, mainly men, and the youngest customers. So there is, of course, space for further research here, especially to find what are the aspects of the cognitive messages that are more appealing for the each type of individual. And we're working on that, and I'm very much pleased to present here. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you, Jaime. Next, we have Mikhail Passo from Erasmus, Rotterdam. He's going to present Trust in Finance and Consumer FinTech Adoption. Take it away.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot for having our paper on the program. So this is joint work with Dennis Okat, who's at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and Vesa Bursiainen, who's at the University of St. Gallen and also in the audience here. I want to say this is very preliminary work, and I'm going to present a lot because we sort of have 3 different empirical strategies in this paper. So if you have any comments, feel free to get in touch afterwards. Yeah, we're very open to feedback. So our paper is sort of inspired by this narrative that the increasing usage of fintech products since the financial crisis of 2008 has been driven by what has been called like a lack of trust in traditional finance. So you see this kind of narrative in the media a lot, that basically consumers just lost, especially young consumers, lost trust in banks and so on after the 2008 financial crisis, and they started using fintech products as sort of a substitute. We're seeing this sort of narrative also be discussed in academic editorials. So for instance, in this review of financial studies fintech special issue, they had a sort of editorial where sort of trust in finance was discussed as a potential driver of fintech adoption. Now, we're not the first people to study this. So as far as we can tell, there are sort of 3 papers out there. Now, these papers all sort of find results which are very consistent with the narrative, so that places which experience a decrease in trust in finance, so for instance, through a financial scandal or through mis-selling of financial products, these places tend to have higher volumes of marketplace loans. So people borrow from peer-to-peer lenders instead of banks. Now, we found this a little bit odd because the households in these counties, they act as borrowers. So it's not entirely clear to us why trust should be sort of relevant, a relevant factor here. And more importantly, these papers concentrate on sort of one element of fintech, so that's sort of peer-to-peer lending. And it's not completely clear whether we sort of expect the relationship between trust and finance to be the same for, cryptocurrencies as they are for sort of payment apps. I just want to also say that why do we study trust? Well, it's because there's this recent strand of research from Guizzo, Sapienza, and Zingales. Apologies for that ambulance outside. Basically studying the role of trust in sort of all sorts of economic and financial interactions, and they basically find that, trust is very important. So our research question in a nutshell is, does trust in finance affect consumer adoption of fintech products? So we focus on sort of 4 broad categories of fintech products, and we sort of have bias towards Europe and America here, in the sense that these are the kind of categories that are widely used in Europe and America. Obviously, if we sort of look at Africa, for instance, mobile money is much more prevalent than robo-advisors, but we focus on these things. So as I mentioned, we're sort of doing this in 3 different ways. first, we're using a large-scale panel of Dutch households, of about 5,000 households, where we can sort of add our own questions to the panel and match the responses to our questions to responses from previous questions in previous waves of the panel. Now, obviously, there's all sorts of problems with that, which we can talk about, which I'm going to talk about later. So we also conduct 2 experiments. The first one is an experiment on Mturk, where we sort of try to make distrust in finance more salient, and then test sort of whether people express more or less interest in fintech products after they've been sort of primed to distrust finance. The second experiment that we have is an experiment on a Finnish investment website. So basically, we work with a popular Finnish investment website to sort of commission articles on topics that may make distrust in finance temporarily more salient, such as, you know, financial scandals or mainly financial scandals. And then we sort of embed links into these articles on sort of fintech products and non-fintech products, traditional financial products. And we sort of track how people click on the fintech versus the non-fintech products in these sort of distrust articles versus a group of control articles. Now, none of our sort of empirical strategies is perfect. They all have different deficiencies. Our sort of philosophy here is that, look, we'll try the best we can to cover the main deficiencies of one method by using a sort of complementary other method. And what we find is actually our results are very broadly consistent across all the methods. So that's sort of very sort of comforting in terms of the narrative we're trying to sell here. So what are these results that I mentioned? Well, they're actually very surprising. They go against the traditional narrative. So we sort of find that in the survey, trust in finance is positively associated with the adoption of payment apps, but no association with sort of other fintech products. And in neither of the experiments, we don't find any sort of association between trust and adoption of any of the sort of fintech products, which is very surprising because it goes against this narrative and it goes against previous research. So that obviously raises the question of, okay, maybe our methods are just flawed. Maybe we're not picking up trust the way other papers do. So we then go and we try to sort of replicate these existing results of existing sort of evidence on the impact of trust on use of traditional financial products. So we do that within the context of the survey and within the context of our Mturk experiment. And we sort of find that in both of these setups, trust in finance is positively associated with use of traditional financial products. So our trust measure seems to at least predict use of traditional financial products, but is completely unassociated with sort of fintech. So finally, we ask why? How is this? And I'm not going to have time to present this because it's super preliminary. But in sort of later waves of the survey, we just ask people, what do they think of fintech products? Like, what do they associate with fintech products? And what we actually find is with a lot of fintech products, consumers don't seem to associate them with financial products, but rather they think of them as sort of a new technology or something similar. But I won't have time to present that today. So preview of our research methods sort of in a nutshell. The first thing we do is a survey. We use the LIST panel, which is a panel survey of 5,000 Dutch households. And what we basically do is we add questions on trust in finance and use and interest in fintech products. And we run a very basic regression of use of fintech products, interest in fintech products across each fintech product category, on reported trust, and a range of controls. Now, the cool thing about this survey is you can sort of match to previous waves of the survey. So you can really control for a lot of things because researchers have been using this LIST panel a lot. So you have risk aversion measures, ambiguity aversion measures, you have education, you have all sorts of stuff that you can control for. So you have a very sort of rich set of controls. But in the end, though, this is still a cross-sectional test, and no matter how much we control for, people might be concerned about omitted variables. Okay, so we move to experimental setups. The first one is on Mturk. So I'm sort of assuming that most people here know what Mturk is. It's a platform where you can pay people to do tasks for you. In our case, the task is to complete a survey. So I'm going to talk about this in more detail, but basically in the survey, we sort of prime people to temporarily distrust finance more. And then we ask whether they're sort of interested in various products. So we ask their interest in fintech products, and in a second wave of the survey for sort of different participants, we ask for their interest in traditional financial products. Now, the cool thing about this is that we can sort of randomize the priming. So some people receive this priming, some people receive a sort of neutral question, and then we can sort of observe differences between these two groups. Now, the problem with Mturk is we don't have a lot of demographic or background data, so we don't really know who these people are. And there is this concern that these people filling in this survey may be sort of professional respondents. So they're completely aware that they're being experimented on, and they might be trying to sort of cater their answers to us. So to sort of address that concern, we work with a Finnish investment website. It's sort of the, I think, the second or third most popular investment website in Finland. And what we do is we sort of commission articles to stir distrust in finance and match these with sort of control articles. In these articles, we sort of embed links to articles about fintech. So for instance, an article like Bitcoin as a part of your investment portfolio, or value stocks as a part of your investment portfolio being a non-fintech thing. And we sort of observe the click-through rates in our sort of treated and control articles to sort of try to measure this. Now, this is cool because it's sort of a revealed preference, measure of interest, as opposed to sort of, you know, where people know they're being experimented on. The downside is, you know, we don't know if people are interested in actually buying this over there. They're just clicking Bitcoin as part of your portfolio out of curiosity. And also, we don't have user-specific data. We just sort of have aggregate click numbers. Okay, so let me sort of show you the results and a little bit more detail on each of these quite quickly. So first in the survey, as I said, we're using this list panel of 5,000 Dutch households. We add a question on trust in banks, which is the typical way to ask for elicit trust in finance, and then fintech adoption and curiosity. So first things first, I just want to show you Dutch households in general trust banks quite a lot. So on a scale of 0 to 10, how much do you trust banks? The sort of most people answer either a 7 or an 8. So they're generally pretty happy with their banks. We sort of plot here the answer to the 0 to 10, how much do you trust banks question across adoption of various products. So crypto, robo-advising, crowdfunding, and alternative payments. We have to discount the robo-advising because in the Netherlands, people, they don't use robo-advising or they are unaware that they're using robo-advising. So the sample there is about 10 people. But basically looking at these graphs, you don't see much of a relationship between the adoption of any product and trust in finance. And we sort of confirm this in a regression setting. So you sort of get a precisely estimated 0. The economic magnitude, if you multiply these out, are close to 0. The one thing we sort of find is that for alternative payment apps in the Netherlands, we observe a positive relationship between trust and finance and their adoption. We speculate that this is because these apps are mostly offered by banks in the Netherlands, but we can't say much to that yet, hopefully soon. The second thing to show here is that we're able to replicate these sort of existing results on trust in finance and use of traditional financial products. So we regress risky investments on sort of trust in banks, and we find a sort of very, we find a moderately strong positive relationship. So I forgot the exact economic magnitudes here right now, but this trust in banks predicts a sort of meaningful part of the variation in whether people participate in risky asset markets or not. So this is like stocks and mutual funds. Okay, now obviously I mentioned we're going to do 2 experiments. So let me sort of quickly walk you guys through the Mturk experiment. So this is the key part of the experiment. This is omitting stuff like the consent form, the debriefing, and the other stuff. So participants on Amazon Mturk, they get a link to our survey. The first two questions in the survey basically asked them to describe, with a maximum of 50 words, a time they felt unfairly treated by family or friends, and a time they felt unfairly treated at work. So all participants see these two questions. Now next, participants are asked to please describe a time they were treated unfairly by a financial institution. So this is our sort of priming. We're asking participants to recall a negative experience they had with a financial institution. And this is sort of randomized. So only half of the participants see this. The other half see a more neutral example. They see, please describe a time you felt you were treated unfairly by a company, for example, an airline. Next, we sort of ask people their level of trust on a scale of 0 to 100 in people in general and banks. And we add the government and large companies here sort of to distract the participants a little bit by sort of not making, you know, we don't make it clear that we're measuring trust in banks, basically. And then we asked how interested are they in these various fintech products. And in a second wave of the survey, we asked for sort of traditional financial products. So the first thing I want to show you is that priming has an impact on trust in banks. So people who are primed to distrust banks report lower levels of trust in banks, but similar levels of trust in people. But if you then take this treated dummy, regress that on interest in our various product categories, we basically see everything is a precisely estimated 0. Now, we also include traditional financial products here, so stocks, mutual funds, and ETFs. And there you can see that you have a slight negative coefficient. So it seems to be that people report lower interest in these. However, it is not statistically significant at conventional thresholds, which is a little bit worrying. So we need to think a little bit about, can we filter out low interest answers? So one thing I forgot to mention is that we pre-registered the experiment, but now that we're seeing this, we might deviate quite a bit from the pre-registration by filtering out some of the people who, you know, say, I've never had a negative experience with a bank or something like that. You know, people who just put no to all the fields. Anyway. Finally, I've got 1 minute left, so let me try to rush through this. We work with a Finnish investment website. The reason we're doing this is because the Mturk participants may sort of be professional survey takers who are aware they're being participated on, and they may try to cater their answers to us, especially because we offer bonuses. So we work with an investment website to sort of commission articles on topics such as financial scandals. So these are articles they're going to write, but we sort of propose a topic, they write the article, they're responsible for all the content. We're not telling them what to write other than the topic. We embed links in these articles to sort of fintech and non-fintech products, and we measure sort of differences in click-through rates. So yeah, this is basically what an article looks like. It's all in Finnish, so it's not very useful for you guys, but basically the key thing is we have these links here. So for instance, here you have 2 links to sort of an article called Bitcoin as a part of your investment portfolio. And we basically see that the percentage of clicks in the control and treated articles to the sort of various categories of financial products are pretty similar across all the products. Obviously, one question that might arise is, are we actually measuring differences in trust? So we do a reader survey. We basically embed a link in our articles to a reader survey. People fill in a survey with a chance to win a gift card. It's not a large sample, but it seems like the readers of our sort of treated articles report significantly lower levels of trust in finance. Of course, this could be a selection effect, but it sort of gives us some comfort. So I'll just leave the conclusion up and thank everyone for their attention.
Great, thank you very much, Mikhail. Our last presenter today is Scott Fulford from the CFPB. He'll be presenting the equilibrium effect of information in consumer credit markets, public records, and credit redistribution. Take it away.
Thank you, and you can hear me?
Yes.
Great, just making sure. So thank you all. Let me go ahead and start my timer because we are nicely, wonderfully on time, and I appreciate all of that. So this is joint work with Ava Najpal, who's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with me. And as always, the views expressed in this presentation are ours and not necessarily those of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the United States. And I used to think I had one of the longer disclaimers, but after seeing the GSA and the US military earlier, I think I'm probably not quite as long. So let me begin by setting a little bit of sort of the general scene. Information is really key to consumer credit. Credit records and credit scores are used to determine the availability and cost of consumer credit. And increasingly, they're used in other areas, things like employment and rental housing, availability of mobile phone, and utility payments. And information is used in this credit scoring is actually expanding. So credit bureaus are pulling in things like cash flow data and rental payments to help bolster their ability to understand who's going to be a good credit risk. So despite all of this centrality of information, we actually know relatively little about the equilibrium effects of information, which is really necessary to understand the public policy trade-offs for what kind of information, for how we should treat information. And let me just actually say briefly that there's some select really interesting exceptions to this, including Andres Lieberman's work in Chile, what we were talking about earlier. So what we're going to do in this paper is use the large removal of derogatory information to estimate both the individual and equilibrium effects of information in consumer credit markets. And I'll tell you a little bit about what this is going to look like. So what we're going to be using are what are called public records in credit reporting. And public records are derived from court filings, and they typically include things like bankruptcy, state federal tax liens, and civil judgments. And we're going to be, throughout the rest of this paper, we're going to be focusing on state and federal tax liens and civil judgments. So I'm going to call those public records rather than non-bankruptcy public records for the rest of the paper, but just to the rest of the presentation for simplicity. All of these things are more concentrated in higher percentage Black areas, and I'll come back to that in a moment. In June 2017, 6.3% of all credit records and 11.8% of low credit score records had a non-bankruptcy public record. So these were fairly widespread. In July 2017, the three major credit bureaus removed all civil judgments and half of state and federal tax liens. This is part of the National Consumer Assistance Plan, which is a 2015 settlement to improve accuracy in credit reports. And you can see that there's just this very rapid diminishment of the number of tax liens and civil judgments. And the remaining tax liens were actually removed in March 2018, whereas bankruptcies, which are also a public record, were constant across credit reports. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this large-scale removal to think about both the individual effects and the equilibrium effects. So first, starting with the individual effect. The likelihood of having a credit card increased by about 2.6 percentage points, and there was a 5.3% increase in credit limits, and a 4.2% increase in credit card debt. So credit utilization actually was nearly constant, despite this large increase in credit. Then we're going to use the large-scale removal to think about the equilibrium effects. And we're going to use the cross-state variation in public record instance to identify the equilibrium impact. And we'll show that there's significant credit redistribution away from consumers who can no longer cleanly distinguish themselves, because they now look like consumers who used to have a public record, who had a public record, and they can't distinguish themselves as cleanly. And we'll be able to reject large decreases in total available credit, but not be able to do much more than that because of the overall identification. And what we'll be able to show is that this overall effect is to actually promote a somewhat more equal racial distribution of credit. So let me talk a little bit more about what public records mean in credit reporting. Our data source throughout is the CFPB's Consumer Credit Panel, which is an anonymized 1 in 48 sample of credit bureau records from one of the 3 national credit bureaus. Public records in credit reporting are collected from public filings, and typically these are court records. And the information in these credit record in the credit that makes to the credit record typically involves the date of judgment or lien, the amount, and the date of payment or satisfaction, whether the public record is paid and reported to the credit bureau as being paid. unpaid public records are much more detrimental for a credit score. Public records are removed from credit bureau records after 7 or 10 years, depending on the type. Public records vary pretty substantially across credit score, so they're typically much more concentrated at this low end, below 600. And we talked very briefly about these two spikes. The spike at 600 is the default credit score for people who have a paid public record of some sort, but really nothing else on their credit record. And at 586 is the default credit score for people who have an unpaid public record and no other information. What we show in the paper, but I won't talk much more about here, is that most of these records end up losing a credit score because the public record was the only thing on their credit report. However, those credit reports were not actively looking for credit, so the welfare cost of this loss is actually quite small. Public records are actually the incidence of public records varies very substantially across states. Let me start with the first state, Indiana. This is all for the below 700 population, just to focus in on the population that has the most action. In Indiana, for people below 700, about 35% of the people in Indiana with below 700 scores have a credit record, compared to only about 5% in Texas. And we're going to be using this large cross-state variation to understand equilibrium effects, because the number of people with public records removed in Indiana is going to be much larger than the equilibrium effect impacts in Texas. The reason these vary so much is that state laws govern civil judgments and state tax liens. And some states make it much easier to bring a civil judgment and are much more likely to have state tax liens as a way of collecting. And you notice that federal tax liens are fairly constant across states, as one would expect, because federal law governs whether there's a federal tax lien. Public records are more prevalent in areas that have a high proportion of African Americans in the track. And so I want to be very clear: we see the population fraction in an area, not the individual race, which is not included in credit bureau data. And as the percent increases, so does the incidence of public records. Now, I want to make sure I'm saying this is as much explained by low income and low credit score as anything else. In the paper, we think through very carefully how to understand removal of information. We have a model of consumer credit markets with many signals of credit worthiness that can be incrementally added or removed. And we show that the removal of derogatory information is going to lead to an increase in credit for those consumers who had the derogatory information removed. They look like better credit risks. It's going to lead to a reduction in credit for consumers who are otherwise ex ante identical and who did not have the derogatory information prior to removal. So these consumers end up being pooled with consumers who were previously had public records, and so they lose credit. And this pooling effect is going to be stronger the more pervasive the derogatory information is. So the more pooling that occurs, the more credit the people who didn't have a public record are going to lose. So let me start with our individual effects. So what we're going to try to do, so we're going to use this exogenous removal of information from the individual and try to understand what the impact for that individual is of having this derogatory information removed. So there are several complications for this. One is that there are dynamic effects. It may take time for someone to apply for a new credit card and to use that newly available credit. In addition, there's dynamic endogeneity. After you have an increase in score because the public record was moved, so you may take on more debt, but that's going to reduce your credit score itself. And so the actual path of things is going to respond endogenously to decisions over time. And finally, there are lots of different effects running around. There are different kinds of public records, with different ages of removal and different reasons for removal. So what we're going to actually do is estimate these dynamic causal impacts using local projection instrumental variables. which, just to be clear, is a big name for two least squares at the appropriate forecast horizon to capture the dynamic endogeneity. And what it allows us to do is scale and combine multiple instruments really efficiently. And in the paper, we also show some reduced form results that use, for example, only unpaid state tax liens, for example, to zoom in on exactly the particular effects. So first, let me just show you what some of these reduced form effects are for the credit score, and then we'll be using the credit score as the scale for all the rest of things. So for a public record that was removed in the National Consumer Assistance Plan, there was an increase of about 6.5 points following a public record removal, and about the same amount in a slightly smaller amount if it aged off before NCAP. Of course, the public records that were removed in NCAP were typically much more recent, and so they have a much larger impact on the person's credit score. So taking those removals as instruments to understand what happens, we show that in the quarter following a public record removal, in the first quarter, the likelihood of having a credit card increases by about 0.5%. And after 4 quarters, it's actually increased by about 2.5%, which is a pretty large effect considering that these are only several about 7-point increases in credit score. Sorry, this is okay, I'm actually gonna skip on that slide. So I don't know why I'm going down. That was why. The increase in having an auto loan goes up, as does the credit card limit. But credit card debt goes up at the same time. And so credit card utilization is almost zero. And just to be clear, these are significant effects, but the average change in credit card utilization, despite the almost 5% total increase in credit card debt at the end of the time, is actually only 0.1% after 4 quarters. So credit card utilization is nearly flat over this time period. So let me talk a little bit about the general equilibrium effects. And my co-author convinced me not to show the full tables. So I'm going to try to zoom in and try to talk about the parts that I think are really important. So first, we want to think about a redistribution effect. Did credit fall more for people with greater exposure to public records removal, but who did not have public records themselves? What we're going to do is define public records exposure as the fraction of consumers with a public record removed in NCAP in individual eyes, state, and 50-score credit band. People with high exposure can't distinguish themselves from more risky population after removal. And we're going to be using that large cross-state and cross-score variation exposure to really identify these redistribution effects. And what do we find? Well, relative to consumers with less exposure, a 1 standard deviation increase in exposure results in about a 0.2 percentage point reduction in the likelihood of having a credit card in the year following NCAP, and a 1% reduction in credit limits, and about a 0.3 percentage point reduction in likelihood of having an auto loan. And I want to emphasize this is redistribution. It's going to measure whether changes in credit relative to other consumers go up or down, and total credit may go up or down. So we also want to think about what the overall market effect is. So what we're going to ask is, in the year following the National Consumer Assistance Plan, did credit fall more for the below 700 score segment than for the above 700 segment? And just to emphasize, this is the causal effect of NCAP, only assuming that credit changes above 700 capture everything else going on in credit markets, which is a pretty strong assumption. So we're thinking of this really as just a way of thinking about what was the overall path of credit following NCAP. And it helps us bound the overall changes in credit, but it's not really but we don't think of it as a strong identification concept. And what we find is that the effects are generally quite small. They vary in sign across products and measures of credit availability. And what this suggests is that the National Consumer Assistance Plan had a relatively small overall credit effect. So it doesn't seem that there was a large-scale withdrawal of credit from withdrawal of creditors from the market. But we don't feel this is a particularly conclusive. This is particularly conclusive about the overall effect. Well, the biggest effect seems to be is redistribution. So let me sum up. Pulling up my. Let me sum up. There was a market-wide derogatory removal of derogatory information in July 2017, and individual aging off of that information beforehand. And for individuals who lose a public record, their credit score goes up, as is the likelihood of having credit card and auto loan. Credit card limits go up as well, but so does debt, and so utilization is largely unchanged. We also look at the general equilibrium effects for people who did not lose a public record. We find evidence of substantially more pooling and redistribution of credit for people with high exposure to low exposure, which tends to be somewhat regressive along the credit scores. And we can rule out significant market-wide effects on credit. Finally, because public records are concentrated in high Black areas, removal tends to be redistributive along a racial dimension because it helps those who had public records and the pooling effect does not overcome that. And I think, and I will go ahead and stop there.
All right, thank you, Scott, for that presentation, and thanks to all the presenters for presenting these very interesting and diverse papers, and also for staying on time. So now we have roughly 15 minutes for a discussion. I should note that at 5:45 or in 15 minutes, the session will just end abruptly. So keep that in mind. It's not that we got offended by some of your comments or anything. That's just the way it is. So how about we take questions from the audience? If you could use the raise hand feature, we can have we can start the discussion. All right, so actually I have a question. Why don't I start off? So I had a question for Yaron. I was curious about whether you see any differences between iPad versus iPhone and Android, because you were mentioning a lot of it's perhaps looking at it in store. And I don't think most people bring well, maybe some people do, but sort of how people use their iPad is slightly different. So are you able to use the sort of iPad versus iPhone and Android behavior to discern any sort of testable hypothesis?
So unfortunately not, because we just don't have enough power. At the time, so we are following the literature by including tablets as a mobile device, but there are not that many. This was in 2011. So there aren't that many tablet users then, and we definitely do not have the power. But just looking at the data today without causal inference, you're right. People seem to be using their tablets more like a PC rather than a mobile device. But at the time, it was probably more on the mobile side when it was new.
I see. And do you see any interesting effects when people are shopping? Is it sort of timed to their paychecks? Have you looked at that at all?
Again, when they're shopping?
Yeah, so the hypothesis is that people are looking at their bank balances when they go shopping. Would that be more prevalent as you near the end of the month or the end of the paycheck cycle, because there might be more uncertainty whether they actually have the money?
That's a great idea. I can look at that if they log in more or less as a function of days till receiving a paycheck. Unfortunately, what I thought you were asking and what I really wanted to do is to check their location when they log in, and I was stopped by the lawyers of the company. So
yeah, that would be a little hard. Yeah, that would be quite interesting as well, but it's getting harder to do that sort of thing. So understandable.
Thank you. I will look into that. Time till paycheck is interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Any other questions?
I had a question for Bronson. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about just sort of what you know about the composition of that sort of I'll call it informal, the stuff that doesn't get recorded at the credit bureau. That's really interesting stuff. And I at least was very surprised when it was as large as it is just by itself. I think that's an interesting thing, that we're sort of getting this insight into these debts that sort of are not formal in the sense that they don't get reported. And just if you could tell us more about that,
Yeah, totally. I mean, unfortunately, almost by definition, they're like difficult to describe, right? They're uncategorizable. So like typically, if you look at these kinds of loans that we're unable to put into one of these kind of bins that show up on a credit report, you see either no information or like really generic descriptions, like it'll say loan, like that's the description. So I think I wish that we could say more about it, but at some level, like I said, by definition, it's uncategorizable because we don't have a good, clear picture of what it is. And that's exactly why we're defining it in the way that we are, which is, let's take all of their debt, categorize it into, bins like credit cards, student loans, and personal loans, map those to a credit report, and then everything that's left over that we can't put into one of these like normal bins, that's the stuff that we're gonna look at as interesting. But like I said, by definition, it's really kind of difficult to say very much about what it actually is.
Okay, I'm not sure if the raise hand feature is working or not. But if you're in the audience and you have a question, I guess at this point, feel free to ask. I had one more question for Rich. I was wondering, I don't know the literature that well, but so for the treatment where you add in this information about the contribution rate, is that just a magnitude of order lower than just making it a default? So sort of in magnitude versus the actual defaulting, how big is that?
So think 2 orders of magnitude.
Okay.
I mean,
okay, so it's just, yeah.
No, like this treatment is sending out 300,000 emails to a bunch of people that don't even necessarily have access to their email on a regular basis. And then they need to take, they need to take action on this email. And so we're saying, basically, we can say that certain messaging is more effective, and we can speak about mechanisms. But as far as a way to using our tools to significantly increase participation, sending an email with a rate prompt is literally, so you're looking at like the literature says maybe around a 30 to 40 percentage point increase in the probability of a contributing going from an opt-in to a default. And we're talking between 0.4 and 0.7 of a percentage point. And so we're big differences between default and our nudges.
Got it, okay, thanks. Anybody else?
Well, maybe I'll add, I think Bronson mentioned earlier, and sort of thinking about bankruptcies, I looked at a bunch of public records because they're public. Bankruptcies are one of them. At least some of the states actually do post them. I sort of wanted to understand what was in them. And just to sort of add, like, I think they make for depressing reading. This kind of, you're seeing people who are kind of at the low point in their lives. I sort of wanted to echo that feeling.
So depressing.
I also felt a little weird realizing just how public all this stuff is. I mean, we don't usually think of many of these things, but sort of I could just, without paying anything, without telling who I was, I could just log in and see this person owed this much to this person and had a wage garnishment brought against them on this date, which was being paid by their employer, who I knew because it was on the public record. Yeah.
No, I agree. Like it's a really interesting data set. And on the one hand, it's kind of exciting because there's so much really good information, but it also is incredibly stark, just how much is out there that is public, and it can be like very depressing. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is exciting, I think, about what we're doing is that I really think that like anything we can do that can help identify people when they're distressed and move them to bankruptcy sooner is better, you know. And I think you know, it's the possibility that we can have policy that actually affects people's lives is always, you know, always an encouraging thing.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, just so we don't end very abruptly, I'll move to end the session. Thanks to all the presenters. Thanks to the audience for giving us some, I guess, something to present for. But I hope everyone learned a lot today, and I myself learned a lot about these very interesting papers. So thank you all, and hopefully we can all catch up in person at some point in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.